"If you go near my daughter again, I'll have you fired, janitor." The words were spoken in a low, controlled tone, but they landed in the sterile quiet of the principal's office like stones thrown at glass. They were flawless, sharp-edged, and left no room for negotiation. Victoria Marston stood with her back to the expansive window overlooking the manicured lawns of Belgrave Academy, a silhouette of power in a dark, tailored suit. Her arms were crossed, her chin was lifted just so. It was a posture of command, one that had surely dismantled men in boardrooms far more intimidating than this. Luke Carter stood before her, his hands hanging uselessly at his sides. He could feel the rough texture of his gray work shirt, the faint, persistent smell of disinfectant that clung to him like a second skin. He was just the janitor, a fact she had punctuated with the final, dismissive word. He didn't say anything. There was nothing to say. He just nodded, the motion small and tight, a silent acknowledgement of a verdict already passed. Her gaze swept over him once more, cold and assessing, before she turned on her heel and walked out, the soft click of her expensive shoes echoing on the polished oak floor. But that threat, as clean and cutting as it was, wasn't the beginning. The beginning was much quieter. It started weeks earlier in the hushed aftermath of the final school bell, with the scent of floor polish and the lonely scratch of a single crayon on paper. Luke's life moved to the rhythm of a squeaking mop bucket and the slosh of soapy water. He had sought out the job at Belgrave Academy for its mind-numbing repetition, for the way the physical labor could exhaust him so completely that by the time he got home to his small apartment, he wouldn't have the energy to think, to remember. Before, his hands had known the delicate weight of a paintbrush, the smooth glide of a stylus across a screen. They had created worlds filled with whimsical creatures and pastel skies, worlds that made children gasp with delight. Now they knew only the splintered grain of a mop handle and the sting of cleaning chemicals. The fire had taken everything. His wife, Sarah, the small house with the sunny art studio, the half-finished manuscript for a book about a star who was afraid of the dark. It had taken the man who lived in that house too, the man who drew for a living, who laughed easily, who believed in happy endings. All that was left was Luke, the single dad, the janitor, and Sam. His son was the only reason Luke hadn't let the guilt swallow him whole. The guilt was a constant companion, a ghost that whispered to him in the quiet hours. He had taken Sam to the park that day, a simple, spontaneous trip for ice cream, if he had just stayed home. He shook the thought away, same as he did every day. He pushed his bucket into the next classroom, the wheels protesting with a low groan. The scent of chalk dust and pencil shavings hung in the air, reminders of a life teeming with energy just an hour ago. Now it was empty, silent, just the way he liked it. His job was to erase the day's messes, the footprints, the smudges, the spills. It suited him. He felt like he was trying to erase himself too. Most days, the school was completely deserted by the time he started his rounds in the West Wing. The after-school clubs would be over, the parents' luxury SUVs long gone, but not all of them. He first saw the girl in the art room, room 104. He was polishing the hallway floors, his machine humming a low, steady drone, when he glanced through the rectangular window in the door. She was sitting at a small table in the far corner, her small frame swallowed by the oversized chair. A cascade of dark hair hid her face, but he could see her hand moving with intense focus across a large sheet of paper. Her backpack was on the floor beside her, along with a lunchbox decorated with cartoon planets. She was always the last one. He learned her name was Emma. He'd heard a teacher mention it once. Emma Marston. He learned her mother was Victoria Marston, the CEO of some tech giant, a name that was always in the business section of the papers he sometimes glanced at in the break room. A woman whose schedule was apparently so important that her daughter was a permanent fixture in the afterglow of the school day, waiting in silence. Emma never made a sound. She never looked up when he entered the room to empty the trash or wipe down the tables. She was in her own world, a bubble of concentration and color. Luke understood that. He respected it. Art had once been his sanctuary, too. He moved around her quietly, a ghost in a gray uniform. The sounds of his work just ambient noise to the symphony of her creation. One afternoon, he was mopping the floor near her corner. The lemony smell of the cleaner filled the air. He watched her for a moment, her small hand gripping a purple crayon with fierce determination as she drew a sprawling, magnificent castle. He remembered that feeling, the pull of the image in your head, the desperate need to make it real on the page. Without thinking, he dipped his mop back into the bucket and, on the damp linoleum floor, he drew a shape. Just a simple, lopsided star, the water darkening the tile for a few brief moments before it would evaporate. It was a gesture without words, a simple, "I see you." The girl's hand stilled. She didn't look at him, but he saw her eyes dart down to the watery star on the floor. Her focus had been broken. For a moment, he thought he'd made a mistake, intruded on her silence. He quickly finished mopping the spot, erasing the star, and wheeled his bucket out of the room. He didn't do it again for a week. He went about his duties, keeping his distance, granting her the space she so clearly needed. But he couldn't get the image of her out of his head, so small and alone in that big, empty room. The next time he saw her, she was drawing birds. Dozens of them, in all shapes and sizes, soaring across a sky-blue page. He remembered drawing birds with his son, Sam, how Sam always made the wings too small for the body. An idea sparked, a flicker of the old Luke, the illustrator, the one who knew how to speak to children without saying a word. He mopped his way over to her corner of the room. This time, he was deliberate. He drew a bird on the floor with a damp mop. A simple profile, but he drew the wing wrong. He sketched it backward, a clumsy, inverted shape that defied all laws of aerodynamics. It was a clear, intentional mistake, a puzzle, a quiet invitation. He held his breath, pretending to inspect a scuff mark on the wall. He watched her from the corner of his eye. She stopped drawing, her head tilted. She stared at the watery bird on the floor, her brow furrowed in concentration. The silence in the room felt different now. It wasn't empty. It was charged with thought. He saw her lips part, just slightly. Then, a sound so soft he almost thought he'd imagined it. A whisper, fragile as a moth's wing, but undeniably there. But it can't fly like that. Luke's heart gave a single hard thump against his ribs. He hadn't realized he'd been holding his breath until it escaped him in a slow, silent stream. For a full year, he'd walked these halls, a ghost surrounded by the echoes of children's laughter. In all that time, he'd never heard this child make a sound. Now, her voice, barely a wisp of air, had remade the silence. It was no longer an absence of sound, but a space that held a secret. He turned his head slowly, careful not to make any sudden moves that might scare her back into her shell. Her eyes, wide and the color of dark chocolate, were fixed on the damp drawing. She wasn't looking at him, not yet. She was looking at the problem, the flaw, the thing that was wrong. He knew that feeling. He let a warm, gentle smile touch his lips, hoping it reached his eyes. He kept his own voice low, just above a whisper, matching her volume. "Then show me the right way." The invitation hung in the air between them. It was a request, not a demand. He watched as a war was waged within her. Her shoulders tensed. Her fingers tightened around the crayon in her hand. To respond would be to engage. To stay silent would be to remain safe in the fortress she had built around herself. For a long moment, she did nothing. Luke was about to turn away, to grant her the retreat he assumed she would choose, when she moved. She slid off her chair. Her small sneakers made no sound on the floor. She walked to the art supply shelf and picked up a piece of thick, white chalk. Then, She knelt on the floor beside his watery drawing, the linoleum cool against her knees. She glanced up at him, just for a second. It was the first time she had ever truly looked at him. Her gaze wasn't fearful. It was serious, professional. This was her area of expertise. With a focused intensity that reminded Luke of his wife in her garden, Emma placed the chalk to the floor. Her hand was steady. She didn't correct his line. She drew a new one, a perfect curved wing, sweeping up with an artist's certainty. It had lift. It had grace. It was a wing that could catch the wind and soar. When she was done, she sat back on her heels and looked at her work. She didn't smile, but a flicker of satisfaction crossed her face. She had fixed it. She had made it right. Luke nodded slowly. "That's much better," he said, his voice still a murmur. "Now it can fly." She looked at her chalk-dusted fingers, then back at the drawing, and gave the smallest of nods. Without another sound, she stood up, returned the chalk to the shelf, and went back to her table. The exchange was over, but something fundamental had shifted. A bridge had been built, one made of water and chalk. Luke knew better than to push. He finished his mopping, his movements softer now, more aware. He was no longer just cleaning a room she happened to be in. They were sharing a space. When he left, he felt the weight of her gaze on his back. That night, for the first time in months, Luke drew with his son. After they finished Sam's homework at their small kitchen table, Luke pulled out a sketch pad he'd kept buried in a closet. Sam's eyes lit up. They drew fantastical creatures for an hour. A three-headed dog with butterfly wings, a grumpy badger driving a race car. Luke felt a familiar ache in his chest, a mix of joy and grief so sharp it almost made him stop. This was what he used to do with Sarah and Sam. This was a piece of the life that had burned down. But as he watched his son laugh, adding a ridiculous top hat to the badger, Luke realized this part hadn't been lost. It was just dormant. The next day, he brought one of Sam's drawings to school. It was a chaotic, joyful explosion of color, a smiling sun with rainbow rays beaming down on a field of purple flowers. He tucked it behind a plant on the art room windowsill, where Emma would surely see it. Their silent conversations continued. Luke never pushed for words. He would leave little sketches for her on discarded pieces of cardboard he found in the recycling bins. A cartoon mouse peeking out from a corner, a simple boat floating on a puddle. He was speaking her language. He knew she saw them. One afternoon, he drew a small, lonely-looking house. When he came back through the room an hour later to collect the trash, a wisp of smoke, drawn in gray crayon, was rising from the chimney. He smiled. She was answering. Her whispers became a rare and precious currency. "The wheels are wobbly," she'd murmur, pointing a small finger at a car he'd drawn. "He needs a friend," she'd say, looking at a solitary stick figure. Each word was a small miracle. He started to see a change in her. The rigid set of her shoulders began to soften. Sometimes, when he entered the room, her head would pop up, her eyes searching for him before quickly ducking back down to her work. And once, just once, as he was leaving, he saw the corner of her mouth twitch into the ghost of a smile. It was working. He wasn't a therapist. He was just a man who knew what it felt like to have your world go silent. And he knew that sometimes the only way to find your voice again is for someone to be willing to sit with you in the quiet. He was helping her, but he realized something else too. In the process of drawing out her voice, he was slowly, carefully, starting to find his own. The chalk drawing on the floor was a turning point. It had been a question asked and an answer given, a treaty signed in silence. From that day on, the art room at Belgrave Academy became a territory of unspoken understanding. Luke learned to read the subtle shifts in Emma's posture, the way she held her shoulders when she was deep in thought, the almost imperceptible tilt of her head when she was curious. And she, in turn, learned that he was a safe harbor. He was the one person in her structured, lonely world who didn't demand anything from her. He didn't need her to speak. He just needed her to be. Their shared language evolved. Luke, with the practical mind of a janitor and the soul of an artist, began to see the school's refuse not as trash, but as a trove of blank canvases. A large, flattened cardboard box from a new shipment of textbooks became a landscape. He'd prop it against a wall, and with a piece of charcoal he'd found, he'd draw the trunk of a great, sprawling tree. The next day, he'd find that Emma had added a canopy of dense, curly leaves and a single, tiny owl peeking out from a knothole. Their grandest project began with the delivery of new art easels. The boxes were huge, sturdy, and destined for the compactor. Luke saw something else. He saw walls. That afternoon, after the other children had left and Emma was settled in her corner, he began to construct a small fort, a simple, three-walled structure. He left it unfinished, an open invitation. He wasn't disappointed. When he arrived the next day, a magnificent arched doorway, complete with a tiny, detailed knocker, had been drawn in black marker on the front panel. Emma was inside, her sketchbook open on her lap, looking for all the world like a queen in her newly acquired castle. Luke expanded it, adding another wall and a crenellated tower. Emma populated it. She drew windows with sleeping cats on the sills and trailing ivy that snaked up the cardboard walls. It was their secret project, a world built from discarded packaging and shared imagination. He continued to bring in drawings from his son, Sam. He'd leave them on the table for her. Sam's art was wild and free, unburdened by the rules of perspective or anatomy. He drew what he felt. One day, Luke brought in a drawing Sam had made of a sad-looking cloud. He left a blue crayon next to it. When he came back later, Emma had added silver crayon tears falling from the cloud onto a small, waiting flower below. She understood. Luke felt a part of himself waking up that he thought had died in the fire. The grief for Sarah was a constant, low hum beneath the surface of his days, but these moments with Emma were notes of a different song. They were quiet, but they were clear. He was creating again. He was connecting. The heavy cloak of guilt felt just a little bit lighter. The day Emma truly smiled, it wasn't because of a grand drawing or a new wall on their castle. Luke was cleaning the art room sink, scrubbing away at dried paint. He had a smudge of green acrylic on his cheek he didn't know was there. He caught his reflection in the small mirror above the sink, and on impulse, he gave his reflection a silly, cross-eyed look. A sound from the corner of the room made him turn. It was a tiny puff of air, a suppressed giggle. Emma was looking right at him, her hand over her mouth, but her eyes were dancing with light. Then her hand dropped, and a real, genuine smile spread across her face. It was radiant. It lit up her small features and chased the shadows from her eyes. Luke's heart felt like it swelled in his chest. It was the most beautiful thing he had ever seen. He smiled back, a wide, honest grin that reached his own eyes. The moment was fleeting. She quickly looked down at her drawing, a blush creeping up her neck. But it had happened. A real smile. A shared moment of simple, uncomplicated joy. It was on one of those afternoons that Victoria Marston arrived. Luke heard the telltale click of her heels in the hallway before he saw her. She swept into the art room like a gust of cold, efficient wind, her phone pressed to her ear. "No, the quarterly projections are unacceptable," she was saying, her voice crisp. "I don't care what the analytics team says. Rework the entire model. I want it on my desk by morning." She ended the call and finally looked at her daughter. Her expression softened, but only slightly, like a mask being loosened, not removed. "Emma, let's go. I have a dinner meeting." Emma obediently began to pack her things, her movements slow and deliberate. Her brief-lived smile was gone, the shadows back in place. Victoria's gaze swept the room, her eyes landing on the cardboard castle in the corner. A faint line of annoyance appeared between her brows. "What is all this?" she asked, not to anyone in particular. "This room is a mess." She didn't look at Luke. To her, he was part of the background, like the furniture. He just continued wiping down a table, his head lowered. He watched as Victoria impatiently tapped her foot, her attention already drifting back to the phone in her hand. She saw the castle not as a work of collaborative magic, but as clutter. She saw her daughter's continued presence here not as a time of healing, but as an inconvenience, another logistical problem in a day full of them. As Emma walked past Luke, clutching her mother's hand, she glanced back at him for just a second. It was a look of quiet apology, a shared secret between them. Luke offered a small, reassuring nod, but as he watched them leave, he couldn't shake a feeling of unease. Mrs. Henderson, the third-grade teacher, had walked past the art room earlier, and he'd seen the way her eyes lingered on him and Emma. Her lips pursed in a thin, disapproving line. Their quiet, safe world was a bubble, and Luke knew, with a sinking feeling in his gut, that all bubbles eventually pop. The feeling of unease lingered with Luke for the rest of the week. It was a cold knot in his stomach that tightened every time he saw a teacher watching him for a moment too long, or when a parent picking up their child gave him a curious, dismissive glance. He and Emma continued their silent work on the cardboard castle, but Luke felt a new self-consciousness. He was more careful, making sure to keep a respectable distance, ensuring that their interactions could not be misconstrued. But it was too late. The gears of misunderstanding were already grinding. The summons came on a Thursday afternoon. He was replacing a bag in a hallway trash can when the principal's secretary approached him. "Mr. Carter, Mr. Aldridge would like to see you in his office." Her voice was polite, but her eyes avoided his. Luke's stomach sank. He knew this was it. Principal Aldridge's office was a testament to order and success. The mahogany desk was clear except for a gleaming laptop and a single, perfectly aligned stack of papers. Awards and plaques celebrating Belgrave's academic achievements adorned the walls. Nothing was out of place. Aldridge himself was a tall, lean man with silvering hair and a posture that was perpetually straight. He gestured for Luke to sit in the leather chair opposite his desk, a chair clearly designed to make visitors feel small. Luke sat, placing his work-roughened hands on his knees. Aldridge steepled his fingers, his expression one of carefully calibrated concern. "Luke," he began, foregoing the more formal Mr. Carter. It was a classic managerial tactic, meant to imply a personal connection while simultaneously reinforcing hierarchy. "You've been with us for almost a year now, and your work has been satisfactory. We've had no issues." Luke waited. He knew the but was coming. "But an issue has been brought to my attention," Aldridge continued, his gaze unwavering. "It seems you have been spending a considerable amount of time with one of our students." "Emma Marston." He paused, as if expecting a confession. Luke simply met his gaze. "I clean the art room where she waits for her mother," he said, his voice even. "We don't really talk." "That's not what I'm hearing," Aldridge said, leaning forward slightly. "I'm hearing about constructions, drawings, a level of familiarity that is, shall we say, outside the scope of your duties. Luke, you have to understand the delicate nature of our environment here at Belgrave. Our parents entrust us with their children's safety and well-being. They expect a certain standard of professionalism from everyone on staff." The principal leaned back, his point made. "And frankly, parents are complaining. It's inappropriate for a janitor to spend time with students." The word stung, just as it was meant to. Janitor, a label that erased any other identity he might have, a box to keep him in. "Mr. Aldridge," Luke started, his voice quiet but firm. "The girl doesn't speak. She's alone for hours. We were just drawing. There has never been anything inappropriate. I'm not interested in the specifics of the activity." Aldridge cut him off, his tone hardening. The mask of concern had slipped, revealing the cold bedrock of risk management beneath. "I'm interested in optics, in perception, and the perception is that a staff member is having unsupervised one-on-one interactions with a student. That is a liability I cannot have. Do you understand? Luke understood perfectly. He understood that in this world of wealth and image, a man's character meant nothing next to his job title. He understood that a child's tentative healing was less important than a donor's baseless complaint. He felt a flare of the old anger he used to have, a hot, defensive rage. But it died as quickly as it came, smothered by the heavy blanket of weariness that had become his life. Arguing was pointless. He was a janitor. He had no leverage here. "Yes, sir," he said, the words tasting like ash. "I understand." "Good." Aldridge gave a satisfied nod. "Consider this a formal warning. From now on, your duties are to be performed without any extracurricular engagement. Stick to the classrooms, Luke, not the children." He stood, signaling the end of the meeting. "And one more thing. Mrs. Marston has been notified. She's on her way to the school now. She insisted on speaking with you herself." The cold knot in Luke's stomach became a stone. He didn't have to wait long. He was still standing in the hallway outside the office, his mind reeling, when Victoria Marston swept through the main doors. She moved with a purpose that seemed to bend the air around her. She didn't even glance at him. She walked straight into Aldridge's office, the door closing sharply behind her. Luke could hear the low, intense murmur of her voice, but not the words. A few minutes later, the door opened again. Aldridge stood there. "She'll see you now, Luke." He felt like a man walking to his own execution. He stepped back into the office. This time, Aldridge moved to stand by the window, ceding the floor. Victoria Marston was the one in command now. She stood in the center of the room, her designer handbag clutched in one hand, her face a mask of controlled fury. She didn't ask for his side of the story. She didn't ask what happened. She spoke, and her voice was a weapon. "I don't know what you think you're doing," she began, her words clipped and precise. "I don't know if you're bored or lonely or what pathetic reason you have for meddling in my daughter's life. But it stops. Now you are an employee here. You are paid to mop the floors. You are not a therapist. You are not a friend. You are nothing to her." Each sentence was a perfectly aimed blow. Luke could only stand there and take them. She took a step closer, her eyes blazing with a cold fire. "Emma is my daughter, my responsibility. Her well-being is my concern, not yours. You will not speak to her. You will not look at her. You will not go anywhere near her again." She paused, letting the weight of her authority settle in the room. Then came the final, fatal strike. "If you go near my daughter again, I'll have you fired, janitor." She turned to leave, her victory absolute. She pulled open the heavy office door, ready to sweep back out into her world of power and influence. And that's when she saw her. Emma was standing in the hallway, not 5 feet away. She must have followed her mother from the car, a small, silent shadow. Her sketchbook was clutched to her chest like a shield. Her eyes, wide and luminous, were fixed on her mother, then on Luke. They were filled with a dawning, horrified understanding. She had heard it all. For a moment, no one moved. The air was thick with the wreckage of the last 10 minutes. Victoria's face, which had been a mask of cold fury, now registered a flicker of shock, then guilt. "Emma," she began, her voice suddenly uncertain. But Emma didn't seem to hear her. Her gaze was locked on Luke, her expression shattering. The fragile trust, the tentative connection they had built with chalk and cardboard and whispers. She had just watched her own mother smash it to pieces. Victoria reached for her daughter's hand. "Come on, sweetie, let's go." Emma flinched. She took a step back, pulling away from her mother's touch. The light in her eyes, the faint spark that Luke had worked so hard to nurture, went out. It was like watching a candle be snuffed in a dark room. Her face became pale, blank. The fortress walls went back up, higher and thicker than ever before. Without a word, she turned and walked toward the school's exit, her small shoulders rigid. The silence she left behind was louder than any scream. The silence in the car on the way home was a physical presence. It was heavier than the leather seats, thicker than the tinted glass that separated them from the rest of the world. Victoria drove, her knuckles white on the steering wheel. She kept glancing in the rear-view mirror at her daughter. Emma was staring out the window, but her eyes weren't focused on the passing scenery. They were looking at nothing. Her face, usually so expressive when she drew, was a porcelain mask. Blank, empty, gone. Victoria had faced down hostile takeovers. She had grilled engineers on impossible deadlines. She had fired senior executives without blinking. She was a master of control. But this silence, her daughter's silence, was an impenetrable fortress she had no idea how to breach. And the most sickening part was the knowledge that she, with her sharp words and cold authority, had just handed Emma the bricks and mortar to build the walls even higher. When they got to their penthouse apartment, a vast, minimalist space of white walls, glass, and polished concrete that often felt more like a gallery than a home, Emma walked straight to her room and closed the door without a sound. Victoria was left standing alone in the cavernous living room, the silence now echoing with the memory of her own cruel words. "If you go near my daughter again, I'll have you fired, Janitor." She had said it to wound him, to put him in his place. She had succeeded, but she had also wounded her own child in the process. Why? Why had Emma looked so utterly devastated? It wasn't just disappointment. It was betrayal. What had been happening in that art room? Anger gave way to a cold, gnawing guilt. For the first time, Victoria admitted to herself that she didn't have a clue. She had seen a problem, a low-level employee getting too close, and she had eliminated it. That's what she did. But she had never once stopped to ask what problem her daughter was trying to solve. That night, after hours of staring at spreadsheets and market analyses that brought her no comfort, Victoria did something different. She sat down at her custom-built desk, opened her laptop, and, feeling a strange sense of shame, typed a name into the search bar. She had to call the school's administrative office to get the janitor's full name, a request that was met with a moment of confused silence. Luke Carter. The initial search results were sparse. Public records, address listings for a low-income apartment complex across town, a few generic social media profiles that had been inactive for years. This was the man. A ghost online, a nobody. It almost confirmed her initial assessment. But the image of Emma's shattered face wouldn't leave her. There had to be more. What did he do before this? What had Emma seen in him? She thought about the art room, the drawings, the castle made of cardboard. On a hunch, she added a new word to her search. Luke Carter illustrator. The screen refreshed, and Victoria's breath caught in her throat. It was like finding a different person entirely. Link after link appeared. Articles from publishing journals, reviews for children's books, a profile in an artist's magazine. There were photos of him, a younger Luke Carter with light in his eyes, his arm around a smiling, vibrant woman with kind eyes. He was standing in front of a wall of awards, holding up a book with a whimsical, beautifully drawn creature on the cover. The captions named him as an award-winning children's book illustrator and animator. His wife, Sarah Carter, was also an artist. Victoria clicked through the articles, her world tilting on its axis. She read about his celebrated style, his unique ability to capture emotion in simple lines. She found interviews where he talked about storytelling, about how pictures could communicate feelings that were too big for words. Then she found the other articles, the more recent ones, the ones that came after a different search. Luke Carter fire. The headlines were stark. Local artist Sarah Carter dies in tragic house fire. Community mourns loss of beloved illustrator. Victoria read the story, her heart pounding a slow, heavy rhythm. The fire had started from faulty wiring in the old house's studio. It had moved with terrifying speed. Luke and their son, Sam, had been out. They'd gone to a park for ice cream. They came home to find their world engulfed in flames. The screen blurred. The cold, sterile anger she had felt in the principal's office felt like a distant memory from another lifetime. It was replaced by a hollow, aching empathy. This man wasn't a lonely, pathetic meddler. He was a survivor. A man who had lost everything and was consumed by a guilt so profound, he had abandoned his gift, his passion, his entire identity to hide in the anonymity of a janitor's uniform. He wasn't just mopping floors. He was doing penance. And he had looked at her silent, grieving daughter. And he had understood. He hadn't used words. He had used the one language they both still knew how to speak. Pictures. The next evening, Victoria drove back to Belgrave Academy. The parking lot was nearly empty, the building dark except for a few scattered lights where the cleaning crew was working. She didn't go to the front office. She walked around the side of the building to the art room. Through the window, she saw him. He was alone, his back to her. He was carefully breaking down the cardboard castle. He folded each panel flat, his movements methodical and devoid of emotion, readying their shared world for the recycling bin. She pushed the door open. He startled at the sound, turning around. When he saw her, his face became guarded, his posture stiffening in expectation of another attack. Victoria walked slowly into the room, her heels silent on the linoleum. She stopped a few feet from him, her gaze falling on the flattened piece of cardboard in his hands. It was the panel with the arched doorway Emma had drawn. She swallowed, her throat suddenly dry. She looked at this man, this grieving husband, this gifted artist, this janitor, and she asked the only question that mattered. Why do you still draw? Luke looked down at the drawing, then back at her. His eyes held no anger, only a deep, bottomless well of sorrow. When he finally spoke, his voice was rough, as if he hadn't used it for anything important in a very long time. Because sometimes, he said, his gaze meeting hers directly, pictures say more than words ever could. The silence that followed Luke's words was different from the others. It wasn't empty or suffocating. It was heavy with unspoken truth. Victoria stared at him, the full weight of his quiet confession settling upon her. He wasn't just talking about drawing. He was talking about grief, about survival, about finding a way to speak when your soul has no words left. She, a woman who commanded language for a living, had been rendered mute by her own loss, unable to connect with her child. This man, with a bucket and a mop, had managed to build a bridge into not just his own daughter's silent world, but into hers as well. The articles I found, Victoria began, her voice tentative, stripped of its usual authority. They mentioned your wife, Sarah. They said she was an artist too. Luke's gaze softened, a flicker of memory warming his tired eyes. She was the real talent, he said, a sad smile touching his lips. I drew things that were whimsical. She drew things that were true. She could find the soul in anything. An old tree, a cracked teacup, me. He looked down at the flattened piece of cardboard in his hands, at Emma's doorway. She would have loved this castle. How did you know? Victoria asked, the question surprising even herself. With Emma, how did you know that drawing was the way in? Luke considered the question for a moment, his gaze distant. When you can't use words, you learn to listen differently, not with your ears, but with your eyes. I saw the way she held her crayons, like they were the only things holding her together. I saw what she drew. It wasn't just doodling. She was trying to talk, to tell someone what her world looked like from the inside. I just figured someone ought to try and talk back in a language she was already speaking. The profound simplicity of it left Victoria speechless. All her experts and therapists had tried to pull Emma out of her world. Luke had simply walked in and met her there. I am so sorry, Victoria said, and the words were not a formality. They were a genuine, painful admission of her own cruelty. For what I said, for what I assumed, I had no idea. I was wrong. Luke looked up, meeting her eyes. He saw not pity, but a shared, flawed humanity. He gave a small, weary nod of acceptance. There was no need for more words. The apology had been heard. Her gaze moved to the dismantled castle. Action was the only way forward. "Don't throw it away," she said, her voice regaining a sliver of its old command, but tempered with something new. "The castle. Let's rebuild it. For her." Kneeling on the floor in her expensive clothes, Victoria was clumsy with the packing tape. She, who could orchestrate a global product launch, fumbled with a simple roll of tape. A quiet, unfamiliar laugh escaped her, and Luke found himself smiling in return. For a moment, they weren't a CEO and a janitor. They were just two parents, trying to piece something broken back together. That night, Victoria went home to an apartment that felt colder and emptier than ever. Emma was asleep, her sketchbook lying open on her bedside table. Victoria looked at the drawing. A small girl alone on a swing set under a sky full of stormy clouds. Her heart ached. On her own dresser was a framed photo of her late husband, Richard. They were smiling on a boat years ago, before the relentless climb of their careers had slowly sanded away their easy affection. She picked it up, tracing his face. He had died of a heart attack, sudden and shocking. But if she were honest with herself, their connection had been quietly fading for years before that. They had stopped listening to each other, speaking only in the transactional language of schedules and obligations. She had been so determined not to fail in her career, she hadn't realized she was failing at the part of her life that mattered most. Looking at the photo, she made a silent vow. She would not make that mistake again. Not with Emma. Their secret story drawing hour became a sacred ritual. On a huge sheet of cardboard, they began a new story. Luke drew a tiny seed buried in dark charcoal earth. The next day, Emma had drawn a single, tentative green sprout pushing its way up. Victoria, taking her cue, drew a bright yellow sun in the corner of the sky. As the days went on, the sprout grew into a tall, strong tree. Emma gave it branches that reached for the sky. Luke added a tire swing hanging from one of them. One afternoon, Victoria, feeling playful, drew a ridiculous-looking purple bird sitting on a branch. Emma looked at it, then at her mother, and a tiny giggle escaped her lips. She whispered to Luke, loud enough for Victoria to hear, "Her bird is sillier than yours." It was a small miracle, a shared joke, a complete sentence. But the storm they were drawing on another piece of cardboard, the one with the boat and the lighthouse, was gathering in their real lives. Harold Redmond, furious at being thwarted in the meeting, escalated his attack. He strode into Victoria's office, his face a mask of cold fury. He didn't just threaten her, he laid his cards on the table. "I know all about the fire, Tory," he hissed, dropping a thin file on her desk. "I know the official report was faulty wiring, but I also know the department had questions about the flammable chemicals from his wife's painting studio. It wouldn't take much for a good journalist to spin that, to suggest things, to create a cloud of suspicion around your daughter's new friend. It was a vile, despicable threat, aimed at the deepest part of Luke's pain. "Get out," Victoria said, her voice trembling with rage. "Fire him," Harold countered. "Hold your own press conference. Announce his termination due to the parental complaints. Be the strong CEO, or I will burn him to the ground, and you'll get caught in the blaze. Your choice." The weight of the ultimatum was crushing. Harold wasn't just threatening her career now. He was threatening to publicly defile the memory of Luke's wife and traumatize him all over again. The meeting with the Parents' Council was no longer just a meeting. It was a battleground where she would have to choose a side, with devastating consequences either way. The day of the meeting, she walked into that office with the weight of it all on her shoulders. She saw Luke standing by the wall, his face etched with a quiet resignation, and she felt a surge of protective fury. She watched the Parents' Council lay out their cruel, class-based arguments. She listened to Harold's smooth, poisonous words. She was about to speak, to fight, to choose her side, whatever the cost. But then the door opened, and Emma walked in. As her daughter walked to the center of the room, a tiny warrior with a sketchbook for a shield, Victoria felt her own fear dissolve. It was replaced by a profound, overwhelming pride. Her daughter was about to do what she herself had been hesitating to do: speak the simple, unvarnished truth, no matter who it offended. Emma looked at the hostile faces, and then at Luke. She took a deep breath, and in a voice that didn't just break the silence but shattered it, she made her declaration. "Let him stay. He hears me." The stunned silence in Principal Aldridge's office was a vacuum, sucking all the air out of the room. Emma's words, spoken with the simple, unshakable conviction of a child, had detonated the council's entire argument. Mrs. Caldwell, the council chair, sputtered, her face flushing a deep, mottled red. "This is absurd. She's a child. Clearly she's become attached, confused. He's manipulated her." Before anyone else could speak, a father on the council, a quiet man named Mr. Jennings, cleared his throat. "Carol, with all due respect," he said, his voice hesitant but firm. "My son plays with Emma during recess. He says she builds amazing things with blocks, but he's never heard her say a single word. Not one. What we just heard, that wasn't manipulation. That was a breakthrough. Maybe we're the ones who are confused." Mrs. Caldwell shot him a withering glare, but the seed of doubt had been planted, the council's unified front beginning to crack. Harold saw his advantage slipping away. He knelt, forcing a sickeningly sweet smile. "Emma, dear," he cooed, his voice dripping with condescension. "No one thinks you're wrong to like your friend. We're all just trying to keep you safe. Grown-up problems are very complicated, and we need to make sure everything is appropriate. The only thing inappropriate in this room, Harold, is you." Victoria's voice was like ice. She rose to her full height, a formidable presence, and walked to stand beside her daughter, placing a protective hand on her shoulder. She looked directly at him. "You dare to patronize my daughter moments after she showed more courage than everyone else in this room combined? You speak of grown-up problems as you actively try to ruin a good man's life to fuel your own ambition. You are a disgrace." She then swept her gaze across the stunned council members. "For weeks, you have all whispered about my troubled, mute daughter. You've used her as a justification for your own prejudice against a man because he wears a janitor's uniform. You wanted to protect the vulnerable? You failed. The person who actually protected her, who listened to her, who gave her the safety to heal, that is the man you are trying to fire." She leaned forward slightly. "So let me be clear. This meeting is over. The ridiculous warning against Mr. Carter is rescinded, and if I hear one more whisper about this from any of you, I will dedicate a significant portion of my company's legal resources to examining every line of this school's operating budget and donor agreements. I am sure we'll find some complexities of our own." The threat, delivered with chilling calm, hung in the air. The council members deflated, their self-righteous crusade collapsing under the weight of her authority. Victoria didn't wait for a response. Hand in hand with Emma, she walked out of the office, leaving a wake of sputtering, defeated agendas behind her. The car ride home was filled with a new kind of quiet, one of peace and shared victory. After several minutes, Victoria finally spoke, her voice thick with emotion. "Sweetheart, that was the bravest thing I have ever seen. Weren't you scared?" Emma looked at the passing buildings. "My tummy was wiggly," she admitted, "but I heard them being mean to Luke, and he's my friend." She paused, then added something that made Victoria's heart ache. "He draws sad things sometimes. I think he misses his wife, so I try to draw happy things for him to find." The simple, profound empathy of her 7-year-old daughter was staggering. Victoria realized Emma hadn't just been receiving comfort from Luke. She had been actively trying to give it too. They had been healing each other. "You have a very kind heart, Emma," Victoria said softly, "just like your friend." The next morning, the world exploded. Harold, denied his victory in private, went public. The article was a lead story, and it was brutal. By 9:30 a.m., Victoria was in an emergency virtual meeting with her head of PR, her chief legal counsel, and 2 senior board members. "The merger partners have officially put the deal on hold pending a leadership review," Jonathan Pierce, the board member, said, his face pale with panic on the screen. "Victoria? This is a $5 billion deal. You have to cut this man loose. We've drafted a statement. It expresses regret, mentions a full internal review, and announces the termination of the employee in question. It's the only move." Her head of PR chimed in. "We can frame it as you taking decisive action to protect the school's integrity. We can weather this, but you have to give them a head. You have to give them the janitor." Victoria listened to it all, her face unreadable. Her gaze drifted to the drawing of the lighthouse Emma had made, now taped to her office wall. She thought of her daughter's courage, of Luke's quiet dignity, of the sad drawings and the happy ones. "No," she said finally. The single word silenced the entire call. "Victoria," Jonathan started. "No," she repeated, her voice now hard as steel. "We are not issuing that statement. We are not firing Mr. Carter. We're going to tell the truth, all of it." "Sarah," she said to her head of PR, "cancel my afternoon. Book the main auditorium and get a press pool in there. And Tom," she said to her lawyer, "get me everything you can on Harold Redmond's expense reports for the last 6 months. I want to know about every golf trip, every dinner, every consultancy fee. The best defense is a good offense." She was no longer just protecting her daughter. She was going to war. Luke and Sam watched the press conference on their small television, the screen filled with the image of Victoria at a podium, facing down a sea of cameras. "You want to talk about my judgment," she was saying, her voice ringing with conviction. "Here is my judgment. This world has enough noise. What it needs is more listening. My daughter speaks today because a kind man, a man who had lost his own world to a fire and had every right to be bitter and closed off, chose instead to be gentle. He chose to help a little girl build a new world out of cardboard and chalk." Her gaze was unwavering. He didn't just mop floors. He reminded a little girl and her mother that your voice matters, even when it's silent. If the board of this company believes that compassion and integrity are weaknesses, they are free to ask for my resignation. But I will not apologize for celebrating an act of human decency. I am proud of my daughter, and I am deeply, profoundly grateful to Mr. Carter. As an unexpected wave of applause rose from the reporters on the screen, Sam looked up at his father, his eyes shining. "Dad," he whispered, his voice full of awe. "She said you're a hero." Luke pulled his son into a tight hug, his eyes stinging with tears. Just then, his phone buzzed. It was a text from a number he didn't recognize. "Mr. Carter, this is Robert Jennings from the Parents' Council. I just wanted to say I am deeply sorry for my part in this. What you did for that little girl. My wife and I were moved to tears. You're a good man." Luke stared at the message, a slow smile spreading across his face. The world outside his small apartment had been loud and cruel, but now, finally, it seemed to be listening. The weeks that followed the press conference were a quiet revelation. The harsh glare of the media, fanned by Harold's malice, had been transformed by Victoria's stand into a warm, persistent spotlight on the school, on Emma, and on the janitor who had listened. The story became a national phenomenon, a modern parable about kindness in an age of noise. Reporters were eventually turned away, the initial frenzy calmed by a firm, united front from Victoria and the school. But the change it had wrought was permanent. At Belgrave Academy, the atmosphere had shifted. Luke Carter was no longer an invisible man in a gray uniform. He was a pillar of the community, a local hero in a way that made him deeply uncomfortable, but also, to his surprise, deeply grateful. One afternoon, as he was checking the supplies in the art room, Principal Aldridge approached him, his usual air of stiff authority replaced by a hesitant, respectful demeanor. "Luke," he began, "I know your plate is rather full these days, but I was hoping I could ask your advice." He went on to describe a first grader named Ben, a boy who had recently transferred to the school after his parents' difficult divorce. He hadn't spoken a word to a teacher or another student in 2 months. He communicated only through angry, scribbled drawings he would show no one and then tear to shreds. "The counselors are trying, of course," Aldridge said, looking genuinely troubled. "But he's built a wall around himself we just can't seem to get over. I was wondering, seeing what you accomplished with Emma, if you'd be willing to just sit with him sometime. No pressure. Just be in the room." The request settled in Luke's chest with a familiar weight. He saw in this unknown boy a reflection of Emma, a reflection of himself. He saw another soul adrift in a sea of silence. The old Luke would have run from such a responsibility. The old Luke was a man trying to erase himself, but the man standing in the art room now was someone different. "Of course, Mr. Aldridge," Luke heard himself say. "I'd be happy to." Later that day, Emma found him by the cardboard castle, which was now a permanent and beloved fixture in the school library. He told her about Ben. She listened intently, her dark eyes thoughtful. She didn't offer any advice. Instead, she went to a table, took out a piece of paper, and drew 2 small, solitary figures on opposite sides of the page. Then, in the middle, she drew a bridge, connecting them. She folded the paper and handed it to him. "Maybe he needs this," she whispered. Luke looked at the simple, powerful drawing and felt a surge of love for this wise, empathetic little girl. She wasn't just healed. She was now a healer herself. The 4 of them, Luke and Sam, Victoria and Emma, began to spend their weekends together, forging a new and unusual family unit. They discovered a shared love for Saturday morning trips to a bustling farmer's market, a place alive with color, sound, and the smell of fresh soil and baked bread. One such morning, while Sam and Emma were earnestly debating whether a lumpy heirloom tomato looked more like a monster's face or a squashed planet, Luke and Victoria found themselves sitting on a bench, watching them with a shared sense of wonder. "I haven't felt this calm in years," Victoria admitted, sipping a cup of coffee. "My life before was a series of scheduled events, board meetings, investor calls, benefit dinners. Even weekends were just unscheduled work time. I think Richard and I forgot how to just sit on a bench." She paused, a shadow of her old grief passing over her face. He loved places like this. He always said you could feel the world breathing. It was the most she had ever shared about her late husband. Luke didn't pry, but he offered a quiet, understanding nod. "Sarah was the same," he said softly. "She used to say that every vegetable had a story. This one grew in the sun, this one had to fight for water. She saw the struggle and the beauty in everything." Victoria looked at him, at the gentle way he spoke of his wife, the love still so present in his voice. "You know," she said, changing the subject, but not the intimacy of the moment. "I used to paint, a very long time ago, before business school, before any of this." She gave a small, self-deprecating laugh. "My father thought it was a frivolous waste of time. He said there was no power in watercolors. So I put them away. I learned to build things with numbers and contracts instead of color and light." "It's never too late to pick up a brush again," Luke said, his gaze warm and direct. "Power comes in a lot of different forms." She smiled, a real, unguarded smile. Perhaps. It was in that moment that she chose to make her offer real. "The foundation is officially chartered. The board is in place. The seed funding is secured. The only thing it's missing is a creative director." She looked at him, her expression open and sincere. "The offer is real, Luke. A real salary. A real studio space downtown, not a converted closet. The chance to build something from the ground up, to find the kids who are falling through the cracks and give them a voice. She then delivered the part she had been holding in her heart. The first program we want to launch is a national grant for unpublished illustrators. A full publishing contract for the winner, mentorship, the works. I've already spoken to the board. They've agreed on the name. She took a breath. We're calling it the Sarah Carter Grant for Emerging Artists. Luke stared at her, his coffee forgotten in his hand. The noisy market around him seemed to fade into a dull roar. He had spent years trying to keep Sarah's memory contained, a private, painful shrine in his heart, terrified that if he let it out, it would disintegrate. He thought the fire had taken her legacy along with her life, that her name and her talent had turned to ash. And now, Victoria was offering him this. Not just a job, but a resurrection. A chance to make something new and beautiful grow from those ashes. To have Sarah's name be a symbol of hope and creation for a new generation. Victoria, he started, his voice thick with an emotion so overwhelming he couldn't name it. She was the real talent, Victoria said softly, using his own words. Her legacy should be to help other true talents find their voice. He couldn't speak. He could only nod, his eyes shining with tears he no longer felt the need to hide. He reached across the small space between them on the bench and took her hand. It felt, for the first time in a very long time, like he wasn't just surviving. He was beginning to live. The culmination of their new chapter came in the spring at the Belgrave Academy Annual Arts Showcase. The gymnasium had been transformed. Canvases and sculptures filled the space, a riot of youthful creativity. The air buzzed with the proud chatter of families. Luke saw the boy, Ben, the one who wouldn't speak, standing proudly next to a small, fiercely colored painting of a roaring lion. He gave Luke a wide, toothy grin and a thumbs up. Just before the final presentation, Victoria found Emma backstage. She was standing quietly before her covered easel, her small hands clasped behind her back. "What are you thinking about, sweetie?" Victoria asked, smoothing her daughter's hair. Emma looked up, her eyes serious. "I hope he likes it." Her motivation was pure, a simple gift of gratitude. "He will love it," Victoria said, her voice thick with emotion. "He'll love it because you made it, and because it's the truth." Emma, her confidence bolstered, walked out to the stage. When she unveiled the drawing, a collective gasp went through the crowd. The portrait of Luke was breathtaking. He was in his janitor's uniform, but she had drawn it as if it were knight's armor. The mop he held was not made of wood. Its handle was the trunk of a young living tree, its roots digging into the linoleum floor as if drawing strength from the very ground he stood on. And the head of the mop was a brilliant, swirling paintbrush, from which a single, magnificent bird, painted in the most vibrant shades of blue and gold, was taking flight, soaring off the canvas and into an unseen sky. Emma stepped to the microphone, her small voice clear and steady in the silent room. "This is called The Man Who Drew My Voice," she announced. She paused, looking out at all the faces turned toward her, at her mother and Sam and Luke, who stood together, a strange and wonderful constellation. "Sometimes," she said, her voice filled with a wisdom beyond her years, "silence is just waiting for someone to hear us." The applause was overwhelming, a wave of pure, heartfelt emotion. Later that evening, the four of them walked out of the school together into the cool, star-filled night. The air was crisp, full of the promise of summer. "So, what's the first thing you're going to do as creative director?" Victoria asked Luke, her tone light and teasing. He looked at her, then at the two children walking ahead of them. Sam telling a wild, rambling story, and Emma providing the silent, perfect illustrations with her hands. He thought of the empty studio space downtown, waiting to be filled with light and color. He thought of the Sarah Carter Grant, of his wife's name becoming a beacon for others. He thought of the little boy Ben and his roaring lion. "I think," he said, his voice full of a calm he hadn't felt in years, The first thing I'm going to do is buy some new brushes." He smiled, a real easy smile that reached his eyes and crinkled the corners. "A lot of them." Victoria laughed, a sound that was clear and bright in the quiet night. She reached out and took his hand, her fingers lacing with his. It was no longer a gesture of comfort or a temporary truce. It was a promise. They were a story made of charcoal and chalk, of silence and whispers, of loss and rebuilding. They were proof that the most beautiful things can grow from the most broken ground, and that the most powerful voice in the world is the one that, after a long silence, finally feels safe enough to be heard. And their story, in all its strange and wonderful forms, was only just beginning. And that's a wrap on this story. But you know, the conversation doesn't have to end here. Let us know down below what part of the world this reached today, and maybe one word that says how it made you feel. It's incredible to think we're creating this sort of map of emotions together. What we're trying to do here is build a home for stories that actually matter. Stories about getting back up, about forgiveness, and that quiet kind of strength. If you want to help us build it, a subscription and a simple like goes a very long way. It tells the world that these stories are wanted, and it helps them travel to places we could never reach alone. I'm just so grateful you chose to spend your time here. Until we meet in another tale, try to be the kindness you want to see out there.